Hello friends, welcome to EPZ Pathsala. Today we are going to discuss globalization, media and pedagogy. This first presentation is part of your paper, Media and Globalization. In this lecture, we shall examine how learning is related to culture, the relationship of globalization to learning, globalization and technology, the contours of pedagogy, and finally, the contours of pedagogy vis-a-vis pedagogy of dislocation. As you may already know, globalization is a phenomenon of the late 20th century, whereby the countries have become interdependent, more culturally exclusive, and defied the restrictions to spatial communication, in which information and communication technology (ICTs) have played a significant role. While globalization was supposed to contain the neoliberalism and complete free market self-regulation, it has been observed of late that it has fallen prey to neoliberalism itself. In this process, it has engulfed the media industry and mediated communication, as also that media and technology have furthered the cause of globalization. Also, the national cultural identity is under threat. As you may probably know, culture is the basis of learning. Culture dictates curriculum. Culture affects how children and adults learn in context. And teaching learning is based on cultural artifacts and cultural community of practice. But first, let us talk in brief about globalization and technology before we get into the learning part of it. It may be noted that there had been technological developments in early times, and more specifically during the global shift from the industrial age to the technology age. Globalization coined the term information age, and due to further developments in information and communications technology, and especially the internet, there have been tremendous developments in ICT itself. Globalization has further accentuated innovations in ICT due to global collaborations and exchange. Well, technological proliferation is as much a product of globalization as a receiver of it too. There are convergences in technologies, and latest developments include, for instance, the 3D, the 4G and 5G, upcoming 5G mobile technologies, big data, and huge information and professional networks. These developments are turning the globe into a unified place. This has also led to more creation, exchange, and distribution of capital, goods, and services. In the process, higher education, which was part of public economy, has now shifted towards technology-driven economy, in which the perceptions and power relations have made significant shifts towards the nations which are judiciously using ICTs for development. In the process, mass production and distribution has been the norm, bypassing individual requirements. Technological developments have got into every aspect of higher education today: teaching, learning, and organization and management. Higher education, which was part of public economy, has now shifted towards technology-driven economy, in which the perceptions and power relations have made significant shifts towards those nations which are judiciously using information and communication technologies for development. In the process, mass production and distribution has been the norm, bypassing, of course, the individual requirement. Technological developments have got into almost every aspect of higher education, teaching, learning, and organization and management. They have also led to changing aspirations and priorities of the people, the changing educational engagements to deal with newer possibilities, problems, and innovations. Teaching learning today has been significantly guided by these developments. Most of the institutions, almost all, are affected by these developments. Inasmuch as technology is providing individual freedom to proceed through individually charted pathways of learning, this has, on the other hand, led to centralized and mechanized process of control and management and governance by institutions. Internationalization of media, as we have noted above, globalization has led to significant revolutions and innovations in media and technology, inasmuch as the former is a consumer of the latter. There are tremendous developments in network technology today and also network learning, which we shall discuss in another lecture in this series. Information and communication technologies have facilitated delivery of education and training from anywhere and at any time to anywhere and at any time. Spatial boundaries have lost meaning in the process. In earlier forms of broadcasting and telecommunications, there had been the practice of communication across borders too. However, the new developments in media and technology have speeded up through multi-channels within what is called an information network. On the other hand, there cannot be monopoly of any one form of media, or for that matter, any one media mogul for all time to come. Over and above, respective governments still have the power and autonomy to regulate the interplay of both national and global media. You may also note that the technological dimension of media has been highlighted more in the process of globalization, and the cultural dimension has been kept at a very low key. The upcoming discussion on pedagogy of dislocation that we will do later, especially in the context of cross-border delivery of education and training, raises the issue of culture and identity in the process of teaching learning. While on the one hand, the traditional media had been linear, imperialistic, and non-flexible, the new media is more open, flexible, and non-hegemonic. In spite of these media characteristics, there are attempts that there are unidirectional cultural flows from the Western, especially American, world to the rest of the globe, that there is standardization of learning resources and also standardization of learning, and that cultural identities are suppressed due largely to what is called McDonaldization of lifestyle. In the process, it becomes imperative that vis-a-vis trade and education services, both the global and local media and media content, especially for education and training, need to be critically examined so as to work toward preserving cultural identity, respecting individual pathways of learning, and sustaining traditional wisdom and in-context innovation and problem solving. Now, let us talk a little more about cross-cultural learning, how culture affects learning. Globalization has influenced cultures of almost all societies and even countries, and media, that is both traditional and new media, they have played a prominent role in this influence. Therefore, learning which takes place and is shaped or influenced by cultural context is gradually becoming cross-cultural. In the process of globalization, while on the one hand there is pressure to conform to the hegemonic Western culture and ways of learning, on the other hand, there is also crisis in the certainties that existed in the mental framework of communities of people, and there is crisis in individual and community identity too. Learners, both overseas as well as the domestic learners, are influenced to transform to the Western perception of what constitutes learning and how it should take place. Globalization impacts culture, ideology, media, technology, and curriculum. These, in turn, impact education and its transaction. Further, it has also brought in new international travelers and migrants, especially in post-colonial times. They include laborers, professionals, consultants, refugees, tourists, and so on. There is cross-cultural amalgamation, coexistence, and at least tolerance. And over a period of time, there is cross-cultural convergence. There is nothing like cultural exclusivity today, since people, especially younger generation as students, are exposed to global media contents and therefore through them to the cultures of other nations. So there is cultural overlap, and curricula have also led to mix of culture and cultural identities. This is more so when globalization brings in forceful inflow of information communication technology, including, for instance, the web-based and online learning resources to which virtually every student and teacher is exposed to today. As you know, learning takes place in context, and therefore learning is a social activity, though individuals construct their own meaning and negotiate within the learning community. So learning and human cognition are situated in context and in community, and therefore basically it's a social or a cultural activity. In learning in context, linguistic, cultural, and communicative processes are involved. There may be great differences in these processes by people from different cultural backgrounds. For instance, Anita Pincus in 2001 gives a comparison between the Australian Aboriginals and the white, generally known as Westerners in the Third World. The Aboriginals in Australia consider knowledge as private, learning as continuity of the past, and that curiosity and questioning are rewarded, they are not encouraged. For Western students, on the other hand, learning is collaborative, it takes place in public domain, learning is for future progress, inquisitiveness and questioning are encouraged, and learning is generally manipulative and transactional. This comparison suggests two contrasting situations of cross-cultural learning. In another example, for instance, take the Chinese learners, where culturally learning involves conforming to authority, while in case of Indian learners, learning is more individualistic without any culture of discourse or collaboration, which is reflected in today's higher education. The situation is gradually changing due to increasing use of technology in education. In technology-enabled learning contexts, learning has possibility of being more exclusive. For instance, web-based online learning facilitates cross-cultural learning by helping students to pursue their own individual learning styles and pathways of learning with freedom to interact and collaborate at one's own choice. Such kind of networked learning involves constructivist model of education in which collaborative engagement is essential. However, it has been observed that as a matter of cultural practice, overseas students do not engage in collaborative learning while studying in Western institutions and cultures. Therefore, here cultural literacy assumes importance in which meaning is continuously negotiated and invariance in perspective is appreciated in a dynamic process of what is called lifelong learning. The problem is arising more today that in the process of globalization, while global learning demands acquisition of knowledge and skills necessary for employability, economic growth, and global prosperity, on the other hand, the cultural ethos of nation states demands continuation of the well-established and well-respected cultural identity and liberal humanism which long dominated the institutions of higher learning. While considering globalization of learning, one needs also to consider learning customs and traditions of students reflected in their own learning styles. This can be made as the base for designing learning content, methods of teaching and learning, use of media, design of assessment, and so on. There must be matching between the global or overseas providers' arrangements with the expectations of the local communities of practice or the local communities of learners. To conclude this discussion, it may be noted that when we say that globalization brings in or is based on global connectivity, there is every possibility that there is cultural exchange across nations and therefore cultural openness and contradiction. And so the design of global curriculum by any government or by any institution for that matter must take into account the cultural diversity across nations, the nationalist focus and concerns of national employers of the education or the degree, and the regional and contextual culture and the community of practice. Let us talk a little more about pedagogy. Pedagogy today is an independent area of study and practice in which the general study of education and teaching learning are related and converge to make sense in respect to any discipline and to particular context of learning. Traditionally, pedagogy implies the science of teaching, and andragogy involves the art of facilitation of learning. In some instances, it indicates direct instruction by the teacher, and in other cases, it also includes morality and common good. In the pedagogic tradition today, besides direct instruction, the teacher is also seen as a facilitator of individual and group learning. Depending on how you perceive or anyone perceives it, teaching learning can be teacher-centered or child-centered or subject or what is called content-centered. Alexander in 2009 underlines that while pedagogy could mean discourse, teaching could be considered as an act. Pedagogy would involve understanding the theories behind the principle of or the practice of teaching. This would simply mean making sense of teaching, the principles behind what one does as the act of teaching. That is, what is behind how to teach. The conceptual understanding as the practice of teaching may differ across nations and across contexts. Therefore, both globalization and its trusted arm called media and technology need to be sensitive to this aspect of culturally wrought pedagogic theory and pedagogic practice. A formation definition of pedagogy is provided by Alexander in 2009, and I quote, "Pedagogy is the observable act of teaching together with its attendant discourse of educational theories, values, evidence, and justifications. It is what one needs to know and the skills one needs to command in order to make and justify the many different kinds of decisions of which teaching is constituted." Unquote. While the relationship between pedagogy and teaching is evident from this definition, she further distinguishes between pedagogy as practice and pedagogy as ideas. A few words about pedagogy as practice. This refers to how teaching practice is informed by pedagogic principles. Teaching involves goals of learning and methods of teaching. Any teaching method further involves the learning tasks, activities to be done to achieve the learning tasks, interactions between and among teachers and students, and contexts and criteria for task allocation and conducting assessment based on those tasks and activities. These are undertaken through clearly drawn lesson plans or unit, take into consideration the classroom organization and student organization that is happens within a time and a space. Now about pedagogy of ideas. Teachers' act of teaching is informed by their beliefs, ideas, and values. The ideas and values center around learners, learning, and teaching, as also influenced by the context, the system, the policy, and the culture, individual as well as collective culture. These all are bound within what is called curriculum. Therefore, curriculum, pedagogy, and teaching are inextricably related. Finally, let us talk about pedagogy of dislocation. Let's examine pedagogy from the context of globalization, cross-border delivery, and/or distance or online learning. We bring in the seminal work by Edwards and Nurse in 1997, who analyzed the process of globalization and based on these, reconceptualize pedagogy. They point out that in the context of globalization and pedagogy, boundaries, space, and place assume considerable importance. At the backdrop of the critical emancipatory as well as feminist pedagogies of location and relocation, they propose the case of pedagogy of dislocation. Due to multiplicity of locations, multiple identities can emanate from the state of dislocation. Therefore, ambivalent pedagogy or pedagogy of ambivalence can best represent the pedagogy of dislocation. In the process of globalization, there is space and time compression, especially due to the application of technology. In spite of greater flow of goods and images, there is the question of location, which interprets these services and images, and location is very important. Therefore, globalization doesn't lead to a universal or global narrative. Rather, relatively and context come to the picture of this interpretation. However, the development of knowledge as legitimate cross borders to be taken universal and applied and adopted by educational institutions across the globe. Crossing national boundaries or national borders, there is formulation of global borders of knowledge, and that which doesn't fall within the legitimate boundaries and bounded legitimacy is excluded from this discourse. And therefore, education, instead of transmitting the national culture, serves the interest of the global economy. This is more pronounced in case of open learning or distance learning or online learning, where ICTs plays a very significant role, which conform to or aim at global markets and therefore standardization of knowledge. In the process, the traditional forms of pedagogy, which are culture specific, become universal pedagogy delivered through electronic mediation. And this leads to problems of authentication of the creator of learning and the process of learning. The structure of pedagogy becomes amorphous, and both learners and teachers or the educators find themselves dislocated in such context of global learning. The context of all education, or for that matter all learning, is flexible and heterogeneous. It could be due to gender or class in a domestic classroom, or due to cross-border education or delivery in a global or overseas classroom. The location being discursive, there is possibility of different identities, and also that the relationship between identity and diversity can be problematic. With changing locations, there is possibility of disidentifying by learners. So, within the range of locations and dislocations, pedagogy needs to be negotiated all the time, in fact, each time. Pedagogical work involves, therefore, negotiation of meaning making due to changing goals, changing contexts, changing values, and changing roles. Since pedagogy is generally conceived within a framework of fixed time and space, globalization brings in deterritorialization and therefore pedagogic shifts. The authors put straight that the reflexive pedagogy of dislocation acts both as an analytic tool and a form of practice. So there is identification with existing meaning, counter-identification through disruption of meanings, and finally, disidentification against existing meanings and practices. This therefore calls for reworking on pedagogy in context of globalization and especially in cases of technology-mediated distance and online learning communities. And pedagogy and knowledge both get reconceptualized in these shifting locations. So friends, now we have come to the conclusion. Let us know some of what we have learned in this lecture. We have discussed in this lecture about the relationship between culture and learning, and the disturbing and the shifting spaces of or dislocations in cross-cultural and cross-border learning. There is a need to reconsider the location, cross-location and dislocation of pedagogy and learning, and that cultural identity, individual learning pathways, and wisdom of the community of practice need to be the foundation on which even technology-mediated learning across time and space can be based. International media vis-a-vis education and pedagogy needs to take these into consideration for productive and sustainable globalization and global learning. This brings us to the end. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. You are advised to read the e-texts suggested very carefully. Do attempt the questions in the self-evaluation quadrant. And for further readings suggestions, please refer to the extended reading list. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.